Hello, everyone. Not quite sure whether 12 noon is morning or afternoon, but there we are. It's time to resume this inquiry regarding the Marks and Spencer store in Marble Arch. This is day 7 of the inquiry. Usual reminders about electronic devices. There's been a lot of documentation circulated recently. I think this has been very useful. The statement of common ground on carbon matters, it does raise a few questions, but I anticipate that they will be covered by your closings. If not, I'll let you know. But that's my expectation, having read through it carefully. I'm content with the latest conditions. Any comments on those?
Thank you.
Similarly, the 106. Any comments on those?
So the only thing I would raise on that is that we spotted that the monitoring fee was payable at the point of completion of the agreement, and the City Council agreed that that should be payable within 5 working days after the any grant of permission by the Secretary of State. So it's a very small point, but you'll be sent a revised version you can see with the comparison.
Thank you for explaining that. Forward to it. Anything else on documentation?
Only to say, sir, that I'm hoping that the local authority will be able to update the inquiry document list to include the ones that were sent to you. Are they already in?
Yeah.
I think so. I think this machine is downloading for me as we speak. It's taking its time, but I think it's working. It means that I won't need the hard copies, that they were very useful during the inquiry.
On the statement of common ground, there was an appendix.
Yes, I've got that as well.
You've got it.
Yep. Anything else? And are you both ready to make the close?
So I've discussed this with my learned friend. I am going to type away. I've been way disrespectful as he is giving his submission, so I can respond happily to you, hopefully. He's going to take about an hour.
Right.
I've suggested that we might take a 15 or 20-minute break then, so we can get it printed. Does that work for you?
Absolutely fine. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Davis, you don't want to make a statement?
No.
So, Mr. Fraser.
Thank you, sir. I'll ask Mr. Oakley to circulate
Thank you.
a hard copy.
Thank you.
So just in relation to your directions that you issued after the CMC, where you indicated that it would be helpful to have something in the region of 20 pages, 10,000 words.
Yeah.
Just for your information, this closing statement is 9,384 words, not including references. Splendid. These closing submissions are structured as follows. Firstly, the effect of the proposals on the significance of heritage assets. Secondly, the effect of the proposals on the UK's transition to a zero carbon economy. And then finally, planning balance. Starting with the effect of the proposals on the significance of heritage assets and the significance of Orchard House and the impact of demolition. Orchard House is a non-designated heritage asset. The NPPF requires that these assets, like designated heritage assets, should be conserved in a manner appropriate to their significance so that they can be enjoyed for their contribution to the quality of life of existing and future generations. The Westminster City Plan provides that although the highest level of protection will be afforded to designated heritage assets, non-designated heritage assets also contribute positively to Westminster's historic environment. As the Council's historic environment background paper states, other buildings, while not statutorily listed, can nonetheless be of architectural and historic interest and may make significant contribution to the character and appearance of an area. The paper also talks about the challenges of ensuring that such assets are protected. Dr. Mealy accepted that, firstly, a building can still have heritage significance, even if not listed. Secondly, an exacting standard is applied to the listing of heritage assets. Thirdly, the standard becomes an increasingly discriminating exercise the younger a building gets. And finally, a heritage asset, even if non-designated, can be of, quote, considerable significance, as was found by the Secretary of State in the case of the Welsh streets. Mr. Forshaw's evidence is that the failure to meet historic England's exacting criteria does not mean that Orchard House is not of considerable heritage interest and heritage significance. Dr. Mealy is alone in his overly critical assessment of Orchard House. He is also alone in finding that it makes a neutral contribution to the significance of the Grade 2-star Selfridges, despite having an affinity with it. Historic England identified the building as possessing architectural and historic interest, and as one which contributes positively to the setting of Selfridges, with which it has strong group value, owing to its stylistic similarities. Although Orchard House does not have the same flair or quality as Selfridges, Historic England consider it to be essentially an evolved version of the same design principle, following the trend of simplifying classical detailing in favour of the steel frame behind. The cornice lines of the two buildings, as well as Hesketh House, are exactly the same height. Mr. Forshaw explained the clear parallels, rejecting the criticism by Dr. Mealy of it being top-heavy and a profound contrast with Selfridges. Mr. Forshaw agreed with Dr. Mealy's statement that Orchard House magnifies the brilliance of Selfridges. It is precisely the supporting and deferential role played by Orchard House to Selfridges which gives Orchard House merit and significance, a quality entirely lacking, seemingly deliberately so, in the proposed building. As Historic England note, Orchard House is understood as a near contemporary building of lesser status, promoting Selfridge's landmark quality and enabling an appreciation of its influence on later design. They share a similar structural and facade design, incorporating classical detailing, stone cladding, and metal spandrel panels, in addition to a consistent roof line. Historic England find that a loss of Orchard House would be regrettable. Historic England, in the assessment of the listing application, find Orchard House to be a well-considered and sensitive response to Selfridges. The council share Historic England's view, finding that the height, massing, and detailed design of Orchard House contributes positively to the setting of Selfridges, and for the same reasons to the setting of the Stratford Place Conservation Area. Harold Clun's The Face of London, much maligned and unfairly so by my learned friend and Dr. Mealy, correctly observes that Orchard House harmonises admirably with Selfridges. Although the Survey of London offers neither a positive nor negative assessment of the building, the former general editor of the Survey of London and Emeritus Professor of Architecture at the University of Cambridge, Professor Andrew Saint, has written in opposition to the scheme, finding Orchard House to be a very decent stone building and suited to the dignity and scale of the street as it then was. Dr. Alan Powers comments, among other things, on the playfulness at Orchard House. Many others have queued up to praise and support the retention of Orchard House, including Nicholas Boyd-Smith, Director of Create Streets, Dr. Barnabas Calder, and the 20th Century Society. The contribution of Orchard House to Selfridges needs to be taken with the point that the building, in the words of Historic England, speaks to the wider historic association of Orchard Street, so Oxford Street, with department stores, most of which date from the same period, and thereby contributes positively to the historic retail character of Oxford Street. That judgment by Heritage England is undiminished by the fact that the building was not designed for M&S, which Historic England expressly acknowledged, and also would not be diminished by M&S ceasing to occupy it in future. Dr. Mealy accepted that the occupation of at least part of Orchard House by M&S the entire period since the building was first constructed in 1930, some 92 years, is a material factor in the significance of the building. The effect of the loss of some exterior fabric is also overstated by Dr. Mealy. The council correctly observed that the upper floors retain most of their architectural detailing. Mr. Forshaw states the lost details, i.e. balconies and sculpture, are, quote, something of a minor matter and should not distract from the fundamental merits of the building, including its overall legibility, the strength of its architectural composition, its place in the transition of architectural style at the end of the 1920s, its deference to Selfridges next door, its contribution to the townscape of Oxford Street as a whole, and to its value as a familiar landmark long associated with a famous brand well known to the wider community. In any event, the various items of decoration and embellishment, which apparently has detracted from its eligibility for listing, could quite easily be reinstated in a refurbishment scheme, along with installing more sympathetic shop fronts. In terms of the interior, the dismissiveness by Dr. Mealy of the original main Art Deco staircase as ordinary is a defensive response, having missed a significant feature in its proof of evidence. The inspector is invited to prefer Mr. Forshaw and Dr. Alan Power's evidence. The staircase is an impressive feature in the building, makes a contribution to the significance of Orchard House, and could add positive value to an imaginative refurbishment scheme, which is supported by the evidence of Dr. Alan Powers. The council does not, unlike virtually every other London borough, maintain a local list of non-designated heritage assets. As Mr. Forshaw explained, the council did have one. Orchard House would be honoured. M&S is right that Orchard House is not in a conservation area, but the boundaries of the Stratford Place Conservation Area, the Mayfair Conservation Area, and the Portman Estate Conservation Area were last reviewed in 1990, i.e. 32 years ago, a third of the life of Orchard House. Dr. Mealy accepted that perceptions of heritage significance change over time. Selfridges is a prime example, being elevated from 2 to 2-star as recently as March 2020. Dr. Mealy accepted that he could not stand by the statement in his proof of evidence that boundary revisions to the Stratford Place Conservation Area were considered as part of the 2008 Conservation Area audit. There is nothing in the 2008 audit of the Stratford Place Conservation Area to suggest that it reviewed the boundaries. Dr. Mealy drew an inference that it had, but there is no evidential basis for that inference. The duty on the council is, emphasis added, from time to time to review and to determine whether any parts of the further parts or any further parts of their area should be designated as conservation areas. It is not a quote, constant duty to consider and reconsider the boundaries of conservation areas, which would be onerous and unworkable. There are around 11,000 listed buildings in the council's area, and the council's conservation officers will be busy dealing with listed building applications, and so there may be a resource issue in terms of reviewing conservation area boundaries, something to which Mr. Forshaw can attest, given his extensive experience as a local authority conservation officer. Dr. Mealy alleged that the council's evidence base for the city plan included a review of conservation area boundaries. M&S referred to the council's historic environment background paper, in which the council claimed that their statutory duties in relation to heritage have been reviewed to make sure we fulfil requirements set out in legislation and policy. The key issues identified from the policy review set out below, fuller extracts and lists of other key policy documents in relation to heritage in local plans are attached at Appendix 2. The council notes that statutory duties in relation to heritage assets remain largely unchanged since the adoption of the existing UDP policy. Appendix 2 includes a reference to Section 69 and the requirement on the authority to review the areas designated. But all this proves is that the council reviewed the statutory duties applicable to them and found them to be unchanged. It is not evidence of a review of the conservation area boundaries. There is no evidence of this having been either proposed or undertaken. The council's representatives have been at every day of the inquiry, and if there were evidence of a conservation area boundary review in the city plan evidence base or otherwise, then presumably they would have told the inspector. M&S point out that SAVE do not claim the council have unlawfully failed to comply with their duty under Section 69(2), but that is because this is a public inquiry into the M&S scheme, not a court of law examining the lawfulness of the council's action or inaction. It is clearly not the inspector's function, or indeed the Secretary of State's, to determine whether the council have acted lawfully in relation to conservation area boundary review. They do say that as a non-designated heritage asset found by Historic England and others to make a positive contribution to the directly adjacent Selfridges, which is inside and a major contributor to the significance of Stratford Place Conservation Area, Orchard House is an obvious candidate and a, quote, clear case for a conservation area boundary extension. In Mr. Forshaw's words, Orchard House has fallen through the net. There are many buildings within conservation areas which are not themselves non-designated heritage assets. It is highly regrettable that the council have not considered in some 32 years whether to extend the boundary to include it. In any event, Orchard House contributes positively to the setting of Stratford Place Conservation Area. The loss of Orchard House will cause harm to the setting of the Stratford Place Conservation Area, as well as to the setting of the Mayfair Conservation Area. The Welsh Streets Secretary of State decision is an example of harm being identified to a conservation area by development outside of it. even in a situation of limited intervisibility, which is not the case with Orchard House and the adjoining conservation areas. Finally, on the subject of conservation areas, Historic England note with some regret that Oxford Street does not benefit from a continuous linear conservation area designation, which might have allowed for a greater protection of this historic retail character. And the street has instead developed a fragmentary character more recently, as such buildings are lost. Mr. Forshaw supported the idea of an Oxford Street conservation area, noting a whole chapter of the Survey of London dedicated to it. SAVE considers that the loss of Orchard House, quite apart from any consideration of the proposed scheme, will firstly result in the total loss of a non-designated heritage asset. That harm is permanent and irreversible. It is the greatest possible harm that can be done to a heritage asset. Secondly, it will cause less than substantial harm to the setting and significance of Selfridges, as well as to the Stratford Place Conservation Area and Mayfair Conservation Area. Impact of the proposed building. Further heritage harm arises from the proposed building to replace what is currently on site. SAVE endorses Historic England's analysis that the new development is of an uncharacteristic scale and materiality and of a particularly bold design. The strident corners and 3 floor levels above, which present a cluttered roofline and would be visible in several key views of Selfridges. This would cause the proposals to distract from and diminish the latter's preeminence in the townscape, causing harm to its significance. There would also be some harm to the Mayfair Conservation Area, particularly along North Audley Street, where the uncharacteristic scale and design of the new development would terminate views out of the conservation area, undermining its consistent historic character and scale. The strident and bold projecting canopy is over 4 metres, or a full story height, above the Selfridges corners. That extra height and the dominant form is readily apparent when one looks at M&S's own drawings. It is a continuous, unbroken element along both frontages, oversailing new setback building lines, whereas Selfridges' frontages to both Orchard and Duke Streets are a collection of distinctly different elements, both architecturally and in scale. The apparently classical references will be unrecognisable to ordinary members of the public walking past. The canopy and setback building line is a, quote, significant departure from the historic building line of Oxford Street. The canopy is a massive element in the townscape. Above the canopy are 4 further stories, although set back to a greater extent on Oxford Street, setback is much less on Orchard Street, causing greater harm to views from North Audley Street and the Mayfair Conservation Area, with none of the careful modelling of the roof and massing of Park House to avoid such harm, with only 4 floors on North Audley Street and the roof breaking back at a very gentle angle, leaving no impingement on the street scene. The additional stories show a lack of cohesive design overall and have nothing to do with the supposed classicism below the canopy. The additional stories present, in Historic England's words, a cluttered roofline, which is clearly visible from the street. The visualizations dispel the Cornelius claim that it would not be possible to see the upper floors above Park House and North Audley Street. In terms of materials used in the new building, the use of timber and brick is unlike anything in Selfridges next door. Mr. Forshaw goes through key viewpoints, identifying the massive change in scale arising from the new building and the harm it would cause to settings of designated assets. Historic England suggests that reconsidering the scale, massing and design of the proposed development could ensure a more sympathetic impact. This might include a quieter corners and simplified roof form. Dr. Mealy's defence to the various claims of harm by Historic England, SAVE and others is to celebrate the boldness, arguing that the scheme would create a companion flagship building, and the difference in scale, module, and the striking modern design proposed would make one better appreciate the novelty and power of the Selfridges design. This relates to his contention that Selfridges, quote, does not need buildings to be deferential to it. SAVE considers Dr. Mealy's entire approach to be wrong. Pushed to its logical conclusion, it would justify almost any form of development next to Selfridges, provided that it creates a significant contrast. SAVE fundamentally rejects the school of thought underpinning Dr. Mealy's analysis and considers that it is not the right way to preserve the setting and significance of heritage assets affected by a proposal. SAVE aligns with Historic England, whose response is informed by the idea that a new building here in the immediate setting of Selfridges should be less demonstrative. SAVE invites the inspector, for the reasons given, by Mr. Forshaw in his evidence to find less than substantial harm arising from the loss of Orchard House and the proposed building, the setting and significance of Selfridges, middle to upper end of the scale, Stratford Place Conservation Area, lower end of the scale, 24 to 29 North Audley Street, moderate to high end of the scale, Mayfair Conservation Area, moderate to high end of the scale, and the Portland Estate Conservation Area, moderate end of the scale. The Secretary of State's decision in Anglia Square, Norwich, is a prime example of harm to the significance of a heritage asset through impacts on the setting reaching the upper levels of the scale of less than substantial harm. The Secretary of State found harm at the upper end of the less than substantial scale arising from impacts on setting. M&S made passing reference to the decision on this issue having been the subject of a legal claim, but that claim was withdrawn in Save's view rightly because it amounted to an attack on the Secretary of State's planning judgment, which is deprecated by the courts. So the decision stands. The reliance by M&S on the more recent decision in Summersfield House goes nowhere. In that decision, the inspector stated that unless the asset concerned derives a major proportion of its significance from its setting, then it is difficult to see how an impact on its setting can advance a long way along the scale towards substantial harm to significance. Mr. Forshaw considers that a significant proportion of Selfridge's significance is derived from its setting, because it is unchallenged in terms of presence and swagger. The Secretary of State is required to have special regard to the desirability of preserving the listed building or its setting, and any harm to the significance of a designated heritage asset is to be given considerable importance and weight. Further, a finding of harm to the setting of a listed building or a conservation area gives rise to a strong presumption against planning permission being granted. Turning now to the effect of the proposals on the UK's transition to a zero carbon economy, the significant heritage impacts not outweighed by public benefits would alone warrant a refusal of planning permission. But there is another very substantial harm and policy conflict arising from this scheme, which concerns the effect of the proposal on the UK's transition to a zero carbon economy. This section is to be read with Save's opening statement, in which it underlines the context of the global climate emergency and the present failure of the construction industry to play their part in addressing it. And so it's noted that today is the eve of COP27. M&S's proposal to demolish the existing buildings and construct a new building is not consistent with achieving the UK's transition to a zero carbon economy. It is in conflict with London Plan policies D3, SI2 and SI7 of the city, of the London Plan, and then City Plan policies 36, 38 and 39. Before considering these policies, it is necessary to set out the consideration of alternatives to demolition of the new building. Starting with M&S's consideration of alternatives to demolition and new build. To look at M&S's consideration of alternatives, the inspector will not find it in M&S's whole life carbon GLA template, because this, in the fourth box on page 1, against the heading confirmation that options for retaining existing buildings and structures have been fully explored before considering substantial demolition, refers to AREP justification of demolition report for further details. There is, however, no such document as a justification of demolition report, as confirmed by M&S to Save in the correspondence following the exchange of proofs. Nor will the inspector find it in the circular economy statement, which contains a summary reference to the limitations of the existing buildings, but no analysis of alternatives to demolition, including in the strategic approach section, which is where it is required and wrongly not provided. That section is focused on how to be circular in demolition, the new build and management of waste, rather than on the decision to demolish itself. For any actual consideration of alternatives in the application documents, it is necessary to look at the design and access statement. Despite Mr. Pilbrow's claim to have considered a deep retrofit of the kind advocated by Mr. Sturgis back in 2018 physical feasibility studies, the DAS indicates that the two refurbishment options given any actual analysis were a light touch refurbishment and a facade retention scheme. That is reflected also in what the GLA said about consideration of alternatives and in the whole life cycle carbon assessment, which compares the scheme only against a light touch refurbishment. There are thumbnail sketches of 16 alternatives on page 100, of which Mr. Pilbrow claimed option 16 was the closest to Mr. Sturgis's proposal. But even that appears to be very different from Mr. Sturgis's scheme, and Mr. Pilbrow accepted that core reconfiguration was not considered. And B, there is nothing more than this thumbnail image to show the exploration of the option. The light touch and facade retention options are not reasonable refurbishment alternatives to a new build. They are easily outperformed by the new build scheme, and it is telling that they are the alternatives which form the focus of M&S's consideration. Facade retention is really not sensible because it still involves very significant embodied carbon costs and presents alignment issues between the facade and the new build. A light touch refurbishment applying M&S's assumptions to this option is self-evidently not enough to deliver a product of sufficient quality with sufficient energy efficiency improvements. That is especially so when one looks at how the light touch option is said to perform in terms of operational carbon emissions. M&S's assumption for the energy used by the light refurbishment scheme is that it would perform poorly against similar stores and be 50% higher than previous energy use figures provided by M&S for the unimproved existing building. As an example of poor performance assumptions, the existing gas boilers would remain in operation for 10 years rather than being changed for a lower carbon source. The scheme has therefore only been tested against a, quote, very poorly performing light touch refurbishment. By contrast, comparison of whole life carbon impacts is made against a theoretical modelling of emissions for the new building that is likely to be optimistic. Accordingly, no weight can be placed on any claim by M&S. The scheme would enjoy a carbon payback after any period against a refurbishment alternative. The applicant has not robustly compared the scheme against a reasonably performing light touch refurbishment, let alone a comprehensive refurbishment of the kind advocated by Mr. Sturgis. As well as only testing two refurbishment options, there were always, quote, straw men bound to fail. Mr. Pilbrow accepted that the key objectives and four criteria against which options were assessed did not include looking at the whole life carbon impact of the options, only operational sustainability. The DAS indicates that the assessment of refurbishment was first and foremost an assessment of the heritage merits of retention. Even as against such inadequate objectives, there is no indication in the DAS of how the alternative options were scored and compared. Mr. Pilbrow confirmed that A, the decision to proceed with a new building was made in 2018 and has never been revisited. B, there is greater understanding now compared with 2018 about embodied carbon issues and the policy framework on such issues has evolved. And C, there was no involvement or consultation of the Council in the decision to proceed with a new building in 2018. The many pre-application meetings between M&S and the Council subsequently were to consider iterations of a new build scheme, not to revisit the principle of new build in the first place. M&S rely on the endorsement of their consideration of alternatives by the GLA, but A, Goddard accepted the obvious point, the GLA's position is not binding on the inspector or the Secretary of State. And Mr. Sturgis considers the GLA did not dig deep enough in terms of assessing M&S's consideration of alternatives. For example, by not requiring the circular economy statement to actually justify the strategic approach for demolition in a new build, see above. And C, the guidance is very new. GLA are still on a learning curve as to how it needs to be applied. Finally, M&S were asked by the inspector on day 2 to provide contemporaneous evidence of their brief to the architects. SAVE wondered if this would show that M&S instructed the architects to consider alternative all refurbishment options, as Mr. Pilbrow alleged. But the evidence submitted says nothing at all about the consideration of refurbishment, refers only to M&S's specifications and standards. For all that is known from this evidence, M&S could have instructed Pilbrow and Partners to design a scheme that simply maximises commercial value. Turning to SAVE's consideration of refurbishment, since first objecting to the application, SAVE have always maintained that M&S should have properly considered comprehensive retrofit of the existing buildings. It is only by exploring this reasonable alternative that the case for demolition and new build could be adequately justified. The purpose of Mr. Sturgis's evidence is not to present a fully worked up comprehensive refurbishment scheme or to prove it is deliverable, but instead to show that there is a significant gap in M&S's consideration of alternatives. M&S should have explored the kind of comprehensive scheme envisaged by Mr. Sturgis from day one, looking creatively at how it could be achieved. what public benefits could be realised, whether it could suit M&S's requirements, how it would look to the market, whether it would be deliverable. This is what, in the language of the guidance, is meant by robustly, fully exploring and prioritising refurbishment. There is nothing unusual or special about Mr. Sturgis's scheme. It is instead a straightforward and logical optimisation of the existing resources on site, bringing them functionally up to current standards and achieving a high quality space. There is no reason why it was not properly considered by M&S. Instead of doing the job at the time, M&S have been forced to try and retrospectively justify their decision in 2018 to proceed with a new build by considering a comprehensive retrofit for the first time in the evidence of Mr. Pilbrough. Inevitably, that consideration is driven by a need to defend the new build proposal rather than objectively and neutrally looking at what can be done on site with an appropriate degree of imagination and pragmatism. This site presents an ideal opportunity for a market-leading, innovative, comprehensive retrofit of the buildings, which would, 1, introduce greater operational energy efficiency in the buildings, 2, avoid the large embodied carbon emissions of the demolition and rebuild, 3, achieve the desired improvements in terms of providing high quality retail and office space, together with new public realm, and 4, avoid the harmful heritage impacts of the proposed new build scheme. Mr. Sturgis and Save are not alone in this view. Significant numbers of eminent architects, developers and others interested in sustainable conservation taken the time out of their busy professional lives to make representations to the inquiry in opposition to the scheme. As Tyler Goodwin said in his evidence to the inquiry, sustainable renovation is good for the environment and good for business, because tenants are now thinking about their commitments to achieving net zero and wanting to be in a building that helped make a difference. M&S celebrate the sustainability of their proposed new building in terms of energy use, but there is a big difference between a sustainable building and a sustainable site strategy. The claim of a 120-year design life for the new build applies only to the structural frame. Mr. Sturgis explained that a new build is not so different to a substantial refurbishment in terms of life expectancy of systems and services. It would be unfair to compare the outcome of the retrofit scheme with what is possible in a new build, which gives the architects a blank canvas. In the words of Charlie Baxter, it is easier. A retrofit scheme will require creative solutions to work around potential obstacles in the existing structure. The question is not whether there will be a need to be a degree of compromise, which is likely to be inevitable, but rather whether any compromise is so significant that the benefits of retention are, in the language of the guidance, clearly outweighed by the benefits of the new building. In the present case, it is correct that a retrofit could not achieve the same new floor space as a new build. Mr. Sturgis estimates 15,000 square metres new floor space in addition to 35,000 square metres of existing area, total 50,000 square metres, versus 60,777 square metres for the new build, i.e. 82%. Mr. Pilbrough accepted that more additional floor space could be added than was proposed by Arup. B, there were other factors to consider alongside the benefits of additional space, such as the heritage and visual impacts, the additional embodied carbon cost, and the need for such space. On the latter point, Mr. Forshaw explained that there are three former department stores, Debenhams, House of Fraser, no relation, and John Lewis, which are all converting retail space no longer needed into new office space. And there is also the Selfridge Hotel, which has been empty since 2008, all of which are making or could make a significant contribution to meeting the need for office space in the area. Although there is a compromise that will inevitably need to be made on column grids, this is an acceptable compromise that would not preclude a highly successful and attractive retail and office space. The issue of column grids has not prevented the Nike store at Oxford Circus from being a successful retail refurbishment of an existing building. There is also potentially a compromise to be had in relation to losing the east-west linkage from Orchard Street to Granville Place, but as Mr. Forshaw explained, public benefit associated with this orientation of linkage was overstated due to the route through the Selfridges from St. Christopher's Place to Orchard Street not being public realm with good connectivity. There is, quote, a limited floor to ceiling height in the food hall, full of people, and there is a steep flight of stairs en route. The proposals for Granville Place cannot hope to compete with St Christopher's Place. More important to achieve is the north-south linkage from Oxford Street to Granville Place, which a comprehensive refurbishment could readily do. Many of the alleged obstacles said to be fundamental by M&S are not in fact problems at all, and are easily resolvable to achieve a scheme of high quality both in terms of retail and office space and public realm improvements, sufficient to meet the requirements for the site in terms of transformation of Oxford Street, best use of the land in the international centre, and compliance with the spatial strategy. Mr Sturgis and Mr Porter will cover them all comprehensively in their evidence. Floor heights, differences in levels, inefficient core arrangement, services, blank windows to the exterior, identity and facade improvement, the loading bay, retail frontage, public realm, colonnade and Orchard Street pavement width, and the level access from the street. In relation to the latter 2 points, the existing 5.5 metre wide pavement outside Selfridges could be reduced to 3.5 metres, which, with the proposed road realignment and reduction to 3 lanes, would enable the required 3.5 metres on each side of the street, or even more if the road were reduced to 2 lanes in an effort to discourage traffic. Secondly, there are multiple existing entrances with level access, which is better than the Pantheon, and the steps to the entrance on the corner of Orchard and Oxford Street is a consequence of topography, which will need to be handled equally in a new build. Selfridge's interior is full of steps. Although a comprehensive retrofit would inevitably have a higher embodied carbon cost than light touch, that cost would be very significantly below that of a new build. Mr Pilbrown and Mr Sturgis agreed that a scheme like this would involve the rationalisation of roughly a quarter of the floor plate of the existing building, mainly by core reconfiguration, but that is still a significantly different embodied carbon impact compared with losing the whole fabric of the buildings and starting again, especially with carbon-intensive multi-level basement excavation as proposed. He said, "You can't really argue that point," and indeed, it was not challenged. As to operational efficiency, Mr Sturgis estimates that a comprehensive retrofit would achieve 95% plus compared with 100% for the new build, given that some of the comprehensive retrofit will be new floor space and the existing space can be subject to significant improvement, for example, double glazing and insulation. In terms of weight, refurbishment easily outperforms a new build, circa 9,000 square metres compared to 35,000 square metres. All of that waste needs removing from the site, and then a vast quantity of building materials needs to be brought to the site, all generating carbon emissions and huge interference to the locality. The evidence of Mr Sturgis, which involves a considered and creative approach to sustainable refurbishment, goes far beyond a mere assertion that there might be a refurbishment option which might bring some of the benefits of the application scheme. He is the only person at this inquiry who have actually undertaken a robust exploration of retention options as required by guidance. He has presented a clear case for an effective refurbishment scheme that would meet the requirements of the site. Mr Pilbrow and Mr Goddard's viability concerns regarding a comprehensive retrofit are difficult to believe given the prime location of this site and the oral evidence of Mr Keith Howard that retailers and officers would be queuing up to be next door to Selfridges on Oxford Street in a well-refurbished building. In any case, there is no evidence to suggest any viability appraisal of a reasonable refurbishment alternative by M&S. One aspect of fully exploring and robustly exploring opportunities to retain the existing building, as required by guidance, is to assess the viability and deliverability of a reasonable refurbishment option. And that responsibility falls upon the applicant rather than anyone else, especially not Mr Sturgis or SAVE, a small charity with limited resources, objecting to the scheme. It is difficult to understand how a scheme for refurbishment could be robustly explored by the applicant without undertaking any kind of viability appraisal. Although M&S say that they have sought to consider the market reaction to refurbishment by obtaining advice from Knight Frank, Mr Sturgis is right that property agents and other advisors will only consider schemes they have been asked to consider, and they have never seen a comprehensive refurbishment scheme of the kind suggested by Mr Sturgis. Knight Frank's expertise is not actually considering refurbishment alternatives themselves, but advising on the market for alternatives proposed to them. It is clear from the Knight Frank report that the refurbishment option they considered was not a deep retrofit, as Mr. Sturgis's suggestion, because it was, for example, still assuming retention of the existing core configuration. Leslie Jones Architects only considered what was set out in the DAS, which has already been shown to have been limited to light touch and facade retention. The inquiry has heard that M&S is struggling financially, and there is no wonder that they are pursuing what would be the most valuable scheme for them. Although a retrofit might not be of such high development value as a new build, the private commercial value to M&S is not a factor to be given much, if any, weight by the inspector. And B, there is nothing to suggest that a comprehensive retrofit could not achieve a very significant uplift in value for M&S, as well as reputational kudos for pursuing a market-leading sustainable retrofit consistent with their Plan A commitments. The inspector should also not be swayed by M&S's threat to leave Orchard House altogether if the Planning Commission is refused. As said in opening, this is not the constructive attitude of the retailer dedicated to sustainability, heritage conservation, and the future success of Oxford Street. It is of a piece with M&S's dismissive approach to any form of refurbishment. There is also no guarantee, even with the new build, they would remain in occupation. To repeat SAVE's opening, this is not a case where overriding the initial embodied carbon cost is justified because the buildings in question causing significant heritage harm or structurally unsound. There is no fundamental structural, facade, deterioration or safety reason why these buildings should be demolished. They are fully viable carbon assets and positively contribute to the setting of designated heritage assets alongside Orchard House being a non-designated heritage asset in its own right. The sustainability and heritage cases in support of retention intertwine. As Historic England noted, the proposals potentially represent a missed opportunity to retain the best parts of the existing building through its reuse and adaptation. This could enable a more sustainable form of development as promoted by the framework, with the positive elements of Selfridge's setting being preserved. Such a solution might also be more sustainable in an environmental sense. SAVE could not improve on how it is put in the Council's Historic Environment Background paper. The reuse of historic buildings can also help in the fight against climate change. Demolishing buildings uses a considerable amount of energy, combined with the energy costs of producing new materials, transporting them to site, constructing and replacement buildings. Sustainable futures will need to find ways to reuse and regenerate our existing building stock. And this is particularly important for Westminster, with 80% of the building stock we will have in 2050 already here today. Our older buildings will play an important role in our ability to function effectively in the future and deliver our housing and employment needs. Policy conflict. It is important for the inspector to understand how SAVE considers there to be a breach of development plan policy in relation to this issue, because SAVE's interpretation of the policies has been consistently misunderstood by M&S. SAVE's case is attacked as wrongly interpreting policy, for example, as imposing an embargo on demolition, or as requiring an applicant to rule out retention, or as requiring retention even where the building is not suitable for the requirements of the site or making the best use of land. This is not SAVE's position. M&S is also wrong to say that SAVE does not understand the distinction between policy and guidance. SAVE correctly uses the supporting text of a policy as an aid to the interpretation of that policy, and uses guidance produced in respect of a policy as an aid to the application of that policy. M&S themselves advocate that the purpose of the guidance is to assist the GLA, or now the inspector, to form its expert judgment as to whether the provisions of the plan have been complied with. Mr. Goddard agreed that, firstly, the guidance informs the decision maker how to assess an application under the relevant policy and decide whether the policy has been complied with. Secondly, although a breach of guidance is not itself a breach of policy, it can be relevant to the consideration of whether a policy has been breached. Policy D3 provides that all development must make the best use of land by following a design-led approach that optimises the capacity of sites. Optimising site capacity means ensuring that development is of the most appropriate form and land use for the site. The design-led approach requires consideration of design options to determine the most appropriate form of development, which involves considering what best delivers the requirements set out in Part D. Part D refers to a number of requirements, including for development to aim for high sustainability standards with reference to the policies within London Plan chapters 8 and 9 and take into account the principles of the circular economy. The explanatory text of policy D3 states, figure 3.2 shows a hierarchy of building approaches which maximises use of existing materials. Diminishing returns are gained by moving through the hierarchy outwards, working through refurbishment and reuse through to the least preferable option of recycling materials produced by the building or demolition process. Best use of the land needs to be taken into consideration when deciding whether to retain existing buildings in a development. Figure 3.2 indicates that retain, refit and refurbish are the priority options in the hierarchy of building approaches. Deciding on the best use of the land and the most appropriate form of development involves consideration of whether to refurbish and rebuild. And there will be cases where the best use of land and form of development is a refurbishment. As Mr. Goddard explained, if retaining existing buildings would result in an important site not making best use of land, then the requirements of D3 would not be met. The converse would also be true, namely that if the refurbishment would be the best use of land, then policy D3 would be breached. In view of their inadequate consideration of refurbishment options, M&S have failed to show that the scheme makes the best use of land and is the most appropriate form of development. For the reasons set out in relation to policies SI2 and SI7, the development would also does not deliver requirement D3, D13, which is to aim for high sustainability standards taking into account the principles of the circular economy. This is the basis upon which the inspector is invited to find a breach of policy D3. Alongside the requirement for major development to be net zero carbon, Part F of policy SI2 requires that development proposals referable to the mayor should calculate whole life cycle carbon emissions through a nationally recognised whole life cycle carbon assessment and demonstrate action taken to reduce life cycle carbon emissions. This is explained in the supporting text of paragraph 9.2.11, which provides that information on what assessments should contain will be set out in guidance. The guidance is the London Plan guidance on whole life cycle carbon assessments, LBPG WLCA, March 2022. As para 1.1.1 states, this guidance explains how to prepare a whole life cycle carbon assessment in line with policy SI2F of the London Plan, using the WLC assessment template. This guidance explains how to calculate WLC emissions and the information that needs to be submitted to comply with the policy. Table 2.1 sets out the WLC principles, which are to inform the design of the development throughout the WLC assessment process. The first WLC principle is entitled Reuse and Retrofit of Existing Built Structures. The principle requires the retention of existing built structures for reuse and retrofit should be prioritised for considering substantial demolition. Principle 16, named Circular Economy, similarly focuses on the need to reuse and retrofit of existing buildings. Section 3 of the guidance requires that options for retaining existing buildings and structures have been fully explored before considering substantial demolition, including incorporating the fabric of existing buildings into the new development. The guidance continues, if substantial demolition is proposed, applicants will need to demonstrate that the benefits of demolition would clearly outweigh the benefits of retaining the existing building or parts of the structure. Retention should be seen as the starting point. This will usually be the most sustainable option, as it can make an immediate contribution towards the narrow objective of London becoming a zero carbon city by 2030, as well as reflecting the need to both move towards a low carbon circular economy and to put development up the waste and energy hierarchies. M&S point out that at the time the application was submitted, the LPG was only in draft form. However, that does not assist M&S. The inspector must consider the application against the adopted guidance as it applies today. And B, in any effect, In any event, the guidance expressly states that applicants are encouraged to keep returning to the WLC principles throughout each stage of the WLC assessment, so that they continue to inform the design of the development as it evolves. Mr. Goddard accepted that if there were substantive breaches of the guidance, for example, a failure to prioritise and fully explore options for retrofitting the existing buildings and a failure to demonstrate that the benefits of demolition clearly outweigh the benefits of retaining the existing buildings, then the decision maker could conclude that an appropriate WLC assessment has not been submitted to comply with the policy. That is safe case for the inspector. It would be open to the inspector to conclude a breach of policy SI2F due to the failure to submit an appropriate WLC assessment and, quote, demonstrate actions taken to reduce life cycle carbon emissions. Policy SI7, Part A of this policy, provides that resource conservation, waste reduction, increases in material reuse and recycling, and reductions in waste going to disposal will be achieved by the Mayor, waste planning authorities, and industry working in collaboration to firstly promote a more circular economy that improves resource efficiency and innovation to keep products and materials at their highest use for as long as possible. Secondly, encourage waste minimisation and waste prevention through the reuse of materials and using fewer resources in the production and distribution of products. Part B of the policy requires reputable applications to promote circular economy outcomes and aim to be net zero waste, and requires the submission of a circular economy statement. Paragraph 9.7.1 of the supporting text explains what is meant by a circular economy, and the supporting text explains that mayoral guidance will be published on circular economy statements. The guidance is the LPG on circular economy statements, which provides, this document includes guidance on how prioritising the reuse and retrofit of existing structures can promote CE outcomes. Circular economy design approaches are introduced in section 2.3, which includes the same hierarchy for building approaches that is found in the supporting text of policy D3 of the London Plan, see above. The use of existing materials must be, quote, maximised. Section 2.4 deals with circular economy design approaches for existing buildings. Figure 4 explains that if there is an existing building on site, consideration should be given to whether it is technically feasible to retain the buildings in whole or in part, and whether the existing building or parts of the building is suited to the requirements for the site. If so, then retention and retrofit is the correct approach to take. Paragraph 2.4.2 provides that retaining existing built structures totally or partially should be prioritised before considering substantial demolition. Paragraph 2.4.3 provides that proposals that are further down the hierarchy will require more detailed and compelling justification. An application should robustly explore the options for retaining existing buildings, either wholly or in part, and that application should set out how the options for retaining and reconstructing existing buildings have been explored and discounted. For the reasons given above, M&S have failed to prioritise retention and have not given the required detailed and compelling justification for demolition and rebuild. There has been no robust exploration of options for retention. They have applied the decision tree to conclude that the existing buildings are not suited to the requirements for the site without adequately considering a deep retrofit scheme. Mr. Sturgis has carefully set out how the existing buildings can, with a comprehensive refurbishment, be suited to the requirements for the site, which Mr. Sturgis accepted include optimisation and transformation of Oxford Street in compliance with the spatial strategy. Mr. Goddard accepted that substantive guidance breaches, if found, would be relevant to deciding whether policy SI7 has been complied with. Those breaches should lead the inspector in applying policy SI7A and B to find a breach due to the failure by the scheme to achieve acceptable resource conservation, waste reduction, increases in material reuse and recycling, and reductions in waste going for disposal through, firstly, promoting a more circular economy that improves resource efficiency and innovation to keep products and materials at their highest use for as long as possible, and secondly, encouraging waste minimisation and waste prevention through the reuse of materials and using fewer resources in the production and distribution of products. Policy 36A of the city plan requires applications to promote zero carbon development and minimise the effects of climate change. Paragraph 36(1) of the supporting text, which is an aid to the interpretation and application of the policy, states it is essential that developments utilise every opportunity to reduce emissions now to limit the extent of future climate change. 36(2) states that support will be given to proposals that seek to sensitively refurbish or retrospectively improve the performance of current buildings to reduce their energy use. Interventions to upgrade historic buildings will be undertaken sensitively in recognition of their heritage value. Saves cases that the scheme has not utilised every opportunity to reduce emissions and has failed to properly consider a proposal for sensitive refurbishment and retrofitting of energy measures. It therefore does not promote zero carbon development to minimise the effects of climate change. City Plan Policy 38 sets out a number of design principles requiring A, that new development will incorporate exemplary standards of high quality, sustainable and inclusive urban design and architecture befitting Westminster's world-class status, environment and heritage. Under Part D of the policy, headed Sustainable Design, development will enable the extended lifetime of buildings and spaces and respond to the likely risks and consequences of climate change by incorporating principles of sustainable design, including optimising resource efficiency. The inspector should also read the supporting text of this policy at paragraph 38.11 as an aid to interpretation and application of the policy. Policy 38D is breached because the development does not adequately incorporate principles of sustainable design, including optimising resource efficiency due to the adequate consideration of deep retrofit. Policy 39 of the City Plan provides at point D that development must optimise the positive role of the historic environment in Westminster's townscape, economy and sustainability, which includes the need for securing the conservation and continued beneficial use of heritage assets through their retention and sensitive adaptation, which will avoid harm to their significance while allowing them to meet changing needs and mitigate and adapt to climate change. The inspector should also read the supporting text of this policy. 39.3 is an aid to interpretation and application of the policy. 39B is breached because the development does not optimise the positive role of the historic environment in Westminster's sustainability. There has been a failure to retain and sensitively adapt the existing buildings, and there is inadequate mitigation against climate change due to the carbon emissions associated with the demolition of a new building as opposed to pursuing a deep retrofit scheme. Turning finally to the planning balance, M&S has argued it saves position on retrofit and heritage is contrary to London Plan and City Plan principles of good growth and the best use of the land. The City Plan Policy 39B3 requires heritage to be at the heart of placemaking and good growth. Policy GG5 of the London Plan recognises the role in growing a good economy by, firstly, under point F, promoting and supporting London's rich heritage assets, and secondly, under point H, recognising and promoting the benefits of a transition to a low-carbon circular economy to strengthen London's economic success. Policy GG6 similarly indicates the centrality of sustainability to the good growth agenda. Mr. Goddard accepted in cross-examination that the best use of the land, as explained above in relation to policy D3, involves considerations of both heritage and sustainability, that there is no policy steer in London Plan policies SD4, SD5 or SD8 in favour of demolition and rebuild over refurbishment. Policies are instead neutral in that regard. For the reasons set out above, i.e. the heritage impacts and the effects of proposals on the transition to a zero carbon economy, the scheme does not comply with the following policies. London Plan policies D3, HC1, SI2 and SI7, City Plan policies 36, 38, 39 and 40. Although there are many ways in which the scheme complies with development plan policies, the conflicts identified above are so significant that the inspector is invited to conclude that the scheme fails to accord with the development plan taken as a whole, and no material considerations would justify departure. There is one alleged highly material consideration, which is in fact not a material consideration at all: the threatened demolition of Orchard House without planning permission for a new building. SAID can only make sense of this threat as an apparent fallback in the event that permission is refused for the scheme. For a fallback to be a material consideration, there needs to be a real prospect of such fallback development coming forward should planning permission be refused. Mr. Goddard accepted that M&S had no intention of undertaking demolition, but may sell the site to someone who would. But the problem with the claimed fallback is twofold. Firstly, there cannot be any evidence of a future intention to demolish, because nothing is known about the identity of any future buyer, assuming M&S do sell the site. And secondly, even if a prior notice to demolish were given, it is known from draft condition 14, which all parties agree is necessary to make the development acceptable, that the council are concerned about having a vacant site due to the harm that would be caused to heritage assets. There is therefore a strong chance that the council would move to extend the conservation area boundary to cover Orchard House on account of it being a newly threatened non-designated heritage asset, which makes a positive contribution to the setting of designated assets. The councillor Jessica Toll said that there is a strong case for inclusion of Orchard House in the conservation area, and no other councillor of the sort of gainsay that. The council's statement of community involvement only provides that the council may consult on proposals for conservation area extensions, not that they must. Where there is an urgent threat of demolition, the council would not permit any delay for consultation. Another consideration, which is not at this stage material, is the City Council's Regulation 18 statement, which proposes a new policy on retrofit. No weight can be given to it at this early stage. Even if it were material, such a policy is not needed in light of the existing policies, but helpfully shows a clear direction of travel in strengthening further the council's ambition to prioritise retrofit. Applying the balance in framework paragraph 202, the inspector is invited to accept the evidence of Mr. Forshaw for the reasons he gives, that the less substantial harm to multiple heritage assets is not outweighed by the scheme's public benefits, many of which, as Mr. Sturgis and Mr. Forshaw demonstrate, could be achieved without the heritage harm through a sustainable comprehensive retrofit scheme in support of the CAS and International Centre. There is also the total loss of Orchard House, which must be weighed into the planning balance under framework paragraph 203. The scheme also breaches framework paragraph 152. The planning system should support the retention, should support the transition to a low carbon future by encouraging the reuse of existing resources, including the conversion of existing buildings. And so you, sir, are invited to recommend to the Secretary of State that the application be refused.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fraser. Mr. Harris, you said 20 to 30 minutes to do.
I think I said 50 to 20, but so if you want 30, that would be fine with me as well.
Well, what should we say? 25 past.
Thank you very much, sir.
Inquiries adjourned.